Good evening and welcome to the study of the Shroud of Turin. The Western United Methodist Church is putting this seminar on, and we're glad to have you with us. It would be appropriate for you to ask, what is my basis for talking to you about this subject? Other than telling you that I have been a reader of this subject for 38 years, a lot of what I would explain to you has to come later in the program. So if you just bear with me a little bit, I'll get around to some of these other issues in a little while. One of the things that would help us get started is to realize that all of us attempt to live our lives using facts. But facts are from different places and for different purposes. What would you require for something to be a fact? Something in which you'll live your life based upon? Well, over the years, lots of things. One of the ones that we can remember from the time of Jesus of Nazareth, they rolled dice. Based upon how the dice landed, that was fact. Now, you probably, when you were young, you asked your mother, and you thought mother's answer was absolutely fact. By the time you're in junior high, you may have decided to read the encyclopedia, and that was fact. And undoubtedly, you can tell that today, an awful lot of people say you Google the internet and you got fact. Sometimes you think maybe that's not good, maybe whatever. So at any rate, all facts aren't equal, as we're going to see, because they come from different places. And the methods, and that's what we're getting after, the methods of trying to find facts differ. And so you should expect some differences and them not being equal, okay? Here's three common sources of what we as people think of as fact. Our personal preferences. I don't like that. It's a bad thing. And for you, it's fact. Our culture tells you that George Washington cut down the cherry tree, right? And a whole lot of other things, and that's fact. That comes somehow out of our culture. You have faith teachings, and you're told those are facts. And it's a settled thing as far as the person telling it to you. We're going to be staying away from this side of it. Our interests are on three other things. We're after the scientific fact. We're after an evidential method system. And when we get to our fourth night, we're going to study the quadrilateral and what it might tell us in answer to this issue of the Shroud of Turin. Now, is it ever true that everything says the answer is B and people go with A? Yeah, we pick out husbands and wives this way quite often. Oh, he's so tall. Oh, she's got such personality. Yeah? And that for us is enough fact to get married and whatever else. So it's not necessarily true that these other things always agree, but that's okay. Now, I would like to clarify that for the first two sessions, pretty much, we're going to be focused on the scientific method as we study the Shroud. Then the third session is going to be focused on the evidential method, and then the last session will be focused upon the quadrilateral method. Okay? The four issues that we could focus on has to do with the authenticity of the Shroud. Is it really what it looks like? A lot of stars on that because we're going to spend a lot of time on that question. Is it the Shroud of Jesus of Nazareth? We're going to spend a lot of time on that too. How was the image created? Ooh, the stars drop off fast. This is a tough one. How did it happen? And how did the process that's described here start? And you won't find any clue there because we're getting into the area that we're not really clear what to say. Now, since 1978, since I started my reading, I want to show you how facts have been changing about the Shroud of Turin. When I started, there were a couple things in the scientific method that said it's authentic. It really is a shroud that covered Jesus of Nazareth. In the evidential, which is more like history and courts use, in that there were a couple of points that were authentic and there were a couple that weren't. And in the quadrilateral, which has to do with faith, there were several things that were authentic, but even one there said not authentic. Okay, fast forward a little while to 1990. A lot's happened by now. We've had a scientific investigation. We've had a major historical breakthrough. And we're starting to see a lot of authentics show up. Do we still have some not authentics? Yes, they're there. 1990. The two biggies, and they're the ones that are heavily known, have to do with the carbon dating. And we're going to spend probably 15 minutes on carbon dating next night. The other one has to do with the bishop's memo. The bishop's memo had to do with saying that I know who made this piece of artwork. And so these two big items were always kind of, it can't be authentic if it's not old enough and if there's someone who, as an artist, prepared it. That's 1990. By 2005, we found out that the carbon dating is flawed. They carbon dated the wrong thing. But as I say, we're going to talk about that more. And they finally figured out that this memo that had, for 98 years had been a real thorn in the side of the study, that it was fabricated. It was fraud. So that went away. So since that point, a few other things are filling in. But after basically 2005, 2007, not a whole lot earth-shattering has happened so far. Okay. I'm going to set it as an equation. The shroud man, whoever was in that shroud, is that the same as Jesus of Nazareth? And is that the same thing as Christ? Christ is a predicted person, image, actor, something that occurs in Scripture. And the way I'm going to approach it is, we're going to use the scientific method to try to understand what shroud man can tell us about the equation to Jesus of Nazareth. We're then going to look at the evidential method, the things that historians and courts use. And we're going to see that same part of the equation. The last session on the quadrilateral will try to get at, is there anything about the shroud that could give us a clue as to whether Jesus of Nazareth was the one that was the predicted Christ? There are a few things, not lots, but at least we might as well take it up toward the end. So that's kind of what we're going to do. 2 nights, 1 night, 1 night. That's kind of where our strategy is going to be. Let's first understand, most of this is review, getting you straight, what happened and what we understand to have happened in Jesus' life and death. The teaching that we have says about age of 30, he began his ministry. You had to be 30 to be an elder. So that would certainly make sense. And the estimate of most Gospels is that he had a ministry of 3 years. This shouldn't be a shock to you. He was mocked, he was spat on, he was struck. The beard was pulled, maybe pulled out. We'll see that question raised. He was scourged by the Roman guards. He had a crown put on his head. It wasn't a wreath like the Greeks. It covered the whole head. He was tied and then had to carry a crossbeam, just the crossbeam, not the whole thing. And he fell, apparently, unusually weakened. All right? So far, no surprises, right? His death occurred after the Passover Thursday. He was crucified on Friday outside Jerusalem. He had to be off the cross because the Hebrews had a deal with the Roman overlords. We want no one to be on the cross overnight, but especially not on our high holy days. Normally the body was hauled off to the garbage dump. We only know of 3 burials of crucified people. So I'll give you some clue how rare it was for them to be anything other than taken to the garbage dump. Death occurred early, and Pilate was surprised. The legs weren't broken. The side was pierced instead. Joseph of Arimathea was allowed to bury the body, certainly a rare thing. He was buried according to Jewish custom. He was buried in a wealthy, unused tomb. None of these should be surprises, right? All this is kind of what you understood. The official seal was placed on the rock face to ensure that nothing happened in the next 3 days. The temple guards remained after the sealing of the tomb, but he wasn't in his grave clothes on Sunday. The guards are still present on Sunday. Normally they were killed if they let something escape. This was one way to make sure people stayed focused on their job. If you let someone escape, your life is taken. And yet, we have in Scripture saying the guards would be safe by telling that, oh, we went to sleep. All right? All this is Scripture that you can look up if you wish. So what was the normal burial arrangement that they had? Well, the women did the preparation inside the tomb. They covered the head during the time of preparation. They washed the body. They put spices on it. They put coins on the eyes if they needed to keep them closed. They tied the chin closed so it wouldn't open. They tied the wrists together. They tied the ankles together. They removed the face cloth and put them on a shroud, which started at the bottom of their feet and went up and over the top of the head and back down to their toes. They closed the tomb for approximately a year. Then they would come back and collect the bones and place them in a box, which would be also then left in the tomb. So a tomb might have a whole lot of bones in boxes that had been kept. This washing of the body, up until about 1995, somewhere through there, was a major issue because it didn't look like the body had been washed in the shroud. But it was finally learned that they didn't wash the body when there was a violent death. They had the concept that a half log of blood could not be lost. Because in the resurrection, the Hebrew concept was you needed all your blood pretty much for the resurrection. So a scene that some of you may have seen in a movie, The Passion of Christ, may have made no sense to you at the time, but this is the explanation. After Jesus was whipped, and there was blood all over the courtyard where they had whipped him, you had people come with cloth trying to mop up all the blood. The point was you tried to gather all the blood for the resurrection of the person. Aha. But as I say, it took years before this point was sorted out. And makes sense now with the shroud because it doesn't look like the body was washed. Okay. Now, I got to get this clear with you that there's not a single thing I'm going to tell you that many people will not object to. Not a single sentence I can tell you. All right? I mean, you got to get this in your head clearly before we can go anyplace, really. Even the fact, did Jesus even live, has many people say, oh, no. It's all fiction, not me. Interesting question. And I'd like to take that question and get that kind of settled up front. How many trustworthy ancient manuscripts do you think there is about ancient people? You probably not thought of it. I hadn't either. But here's some examples. Ancient trustworthy manuscripts, 27 for Cicero. Okay? Virgil, 19. You've probably heard some of these names. Pliny the Elder, 200. That's a pretty good number on his case. Homer was a writer, so 670 makes more sense. Are you shocked that only 3 ancient trustworthy things exist for Aristotle, and 6 for Euclid, 7 for Plato? We don't think about this question a whole lot. How many things can we rely upon for translation purposes? Tacitus was a Roman historian who mentioned Jesus, only 36 for him. Josephus was a Hebrew historian who mentions Jesus, and there's only 8 for him. So how many do you think there were for Jesus? Now, you've been forced to maybe think about it for the first time. And you start saying, well, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke. you start going through these various numbers and think, well, maybe there aren't that many after. I mean, as I say, we don't think much about it. So you could have a vote here, and we could put up our numbers of what we think. It's usually a shock to people because they've never thought about the question, how historically accurate are all these ancients and documentation of them? Well, in the case of Jesus, we have a pile of stuff. Jesus has more ancient, trustworthy documents to work with than all the other ancients together. Okay? Now, I have 144 items rejected because I want to make clear that I'm not including the Apocrypha to the New Testament. You didn't maybe know that there was one. But there is such a document, and all these things have been written down about Pilate and Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Peter, things that are not in the Bible as you're used to seeing them. I'm not including those. But as of 1992, you have basically 5,000 items to work with. When this thing blinks, that's a reminder for me to show you something. If I fail to show you something, wave your hand as you're supposed to show us something from this table up here, okay? All right. It's not just the number of documents. There's also an issue of how many years between the original event and the copy that we have. None of these are the original items. They have always been copied and recopied and recopied. An average for things associated with Jesus is 719 years between him walking the earth and the copies that we rely upon. But you can also see that the gap for the others is 50% greater. So we have this issue of reliability and how well do they do. We certainly know with the Hebrew Bible, their scriptoriums were very, very accurately focused. They had people who knew the count to a certain word, and they would then count a scribe's work. And if they didn't come to exactly that number at that point, they knew somewhere something had been added or subtracted. Now, that doesn't mean you can't offset it, but at least they had techniques to try to make sure they came out to the right place. But my point that I'm trying to get to is that Jesus is very well documented, but you will have many people who argue, nah, there's no basis of believing this man ever walked the face of the earth. Part of the reason has to do with the fact that if this shroud is authentic, it really raises the question of a major question about faith, the resurrection of the dead. And that makes it the most emotionally divisive physical item that we have if people start to understand what it means. But I'm going to tell you that's not a science problem. If science will apply its methods, its techniques accurately, that's not to be an issue. But this is something you've got to keep in mind. And as we go forward, as I'm explaining things to you, I have to always in my head remember there are many writers who say, no, nothing to that. Nothing to the next sentence, nothing to the next. I mean, they keep ruling everything out. That's just background to it. What we're going to do occurred because I got a call one day when I lived in Alabama, and the person knew what I'd done at church with the Shroud, and she said, will you come to the high school and will you there explain to our advanced placement physics students, our advanced placement biology students, and our advanced placement chemistry students, will you talk to them about the Shroud? I agreed. And then I called back and said, I can't do it. You will get yourself in trouble in a public school if I talk about this subject. Eventually it's going to happen. But I said, here's what I can do. I can teach the 10 characteristics of science just like I have in my college courses. And that can use the Shroud of Turin as the example of what happens when you make the application. How could someone complain about using the most studied physical object in our world to teach the concepts of science? So that's what I did. And that's how this thing got put together in the way in which you're seeing it. Our question is going to be, could the Shroud of Turin be the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth? Note what it's not. It's not, could the shroud be the burial cloth of Christ, a prophesied figure? Remember, we're going to do it as an equation. We're going to take the shroud man, to Jesus of Nazareth, and then as an add-on, we're going to raise this question. Now, at the high schools, I didn't go into this part, as you can imagine. But we had Muslims, we had Jews, we had a wide variety of people who for half a day or more worked with me to go through the 10 characteristics of science and what we found. So here we go. The image is a very faint thing. And if you were within 6 feet of the image, you can't see it. Does that sound strange to you? Well, something about your eyes. Your eye doesn't stay steady. It goes boop, 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 just fraction. And it's trying to detect, it's trying to detect where the edge of something is visually. Have you ever noticed when you have a red line set alternating with blue and it looks like it vibrates? That's because your eye is shifting back and forth between the two. And it drives your eye nuts. Okay? Well, with the shroud, you've got to be 6 feet away or you can't see the thing. You can't find the image on it. And this, of course, was one of the early arguments. Surely this thing could not be genuine, because how could an artist paint it if he can't reach it? If he has to be 6 feet away, how does he get the blame brush onto the thing to even try and make the thing work? The cloth seems extremely young, and it's described as being kind of like a stiff t-shirt. And what I want to do at this point is to send this around as an example of what the shroud would be like. This was a special run done, we'll talk more about it later, where they tried to put the thing in the proper perspective, but I did one extra thing. I removed a little bit of the backing on a corner. Take your time to touch the thing because they tried to get the cloth accurate for what the shroud would be like. So they give you a feel for what the shroud would be like. And this is kind of what the thing would look like. Now, we're going to go into detail about this with the advantage of slides, but this is a shrunken down version done as best they can do it to present it to people to buy. Let me send that. The shroud was kept rolled up in a silver casket most of its time. It's now in a flat storage. We're going to see how that change happened. It was owned by the Italian king until 1983. The Roman Catholic Church is now the owner. Okay? It's only up until 2002. It had only been out of its casket about 300 days in the time in which we know it in Western civilization. It has been exhibited about 3 times per century, but you notice after the year 2000, suddenly we've had a whole lot more. Whether that's going to continue to be true isn't known. 2025, theoretically, is the next time, but obviously they keep adding them in. So we'll see what happens. The Shroud background has pre-science years. Notice I'm starting with 1357 AD, because that's when it becomes public in Europe. That's when we start to have the great understanding and discussion and everything else about it. The Savoy Palace in Turin, Italy, was where the thing has been kept. And it was kept in a silver casket, and they rolled it in a circle form, as you see. It had a red covering over the thing. And you can now see in this painting an example of how they understood the thing to be used, starting at the toes, going around the head, and all the way down. With the consequence that you have 2 heads on the shroud if you're looking at it. The back of the head at the center and the front of the head at the center, both coming together. The body apparently was not flat. The burial technique was to put some support under the head and then to tie the jaw shut, tie the legs together, and you'll notice the knees are up, and in a crucifixion, that would be absolutely true. The rigor mortis would be the issue there, that the bodies had a rigidity to it from what had happened to it on the cross. In the guesses as to how it would normally have been used, number 4 is the way to think that probably it was placed on Shroud Man, that it was crumpled up around Shroud Man, so it was not flat, and it wasn't excessively crumpled, and it certainly had no bands going around it, even though you could guess that as a possibility from looking at your scriptures. It talks about the binding, and so that is a possible interpretation. But number 4 is what they think the actual use of it was. It has a 3-in-1 herringbone weave. So as opposed to a plain weave, over, under, there's a different pattern to it, and it's considered to be a very, very expensive weave of material, and known at least 400 years BC. This is a diagram trying to explain the difference between a common herringbone 3-in-1 and an extraordinarily expensive one, a superb one. And it's considered to be superb. So there's a lot of money in this shroud, whoever got it. There's a limited amount of cotton which came from ancient Egypt. The weave was common enough, but usually was in silk around the time of Jesus of Nazareth. The looms used some flax for this particular shroud, but there's some traces of cotton in it. No wool. And the fact that the Hebrews wouldn't permit wool and cotton to be on the same loom makes us think, in the great scheme of things, it must be from Middle East origin. It must be from Hebrew looms. Now, one of the significant elements of that is to understand that this is one of dozens of things that could be presented, saying that if someone faked this thing in 1357, they knew a great deal of stuff that we're only now learning about cloth and what happened. Now, I'm going to make a list, and this is a layman's list. And you can see some conclusions I'm starting to line up. It was used in the normal Jewish burial manner in the 1st century. Middle Eastern origins, probably Jewish loom. A very wealthy person had to be involved in it somewhere. Can you see how we just start to put some ideas together? All right. This is the shroud darkened, and you can see the point at which the center line happens, and we're going to see a head here and the back of the head over there. We'll see this again in different ways. This area shows a water stain. This area shows one of several patches that was applied after there was a fire. And then the corner over here is showing you an area that was cut and something was put in its place. And there are several different theories as to why that happened. May have taken souvenirs, or the way they held it at the corners may have damaged it so much they had to put a piece in as a replacement, because when they held it up, they held by the corners. So several possibilities. The description says we probably have a male Sephardic Jew, about 5 feet, 10 and a half, maybe now 11 and a half, because it's cloth. And once they took off, what we're going to see is the backing. It's actually a little bit longer. So the estimate's 5'10 and a half, 5'11, somewhere through there. And it had an unbound pigtail hair, which was the style of the people in the Hebrew times, first century. You can see the patches. I'm looking just at the half now of the shroud. You can see the patches that were put on after the 1532 fire. This is the best way for you probably to do it. You're probably saying, where is the image? Okay, I'm going to give you a clue. All right? Are you ready? Now I'm going to take the clue away. So now you can maybe see better the beard and the eyes, and of course down the body, down the middle. The fire did not touch much at all of the actual image, but you can see it certainly burned a lot of stuff right beside it. And on the back, it's the same thing. Take away the guidelines, and you can see the back of the head. We will eventually look at the blood marks here, and here you have the feet. And the right foot, that's this one, is a lot longer than the left foot, okay, in the image. Of significance is the fact there's no decay, there's no evidence of fluid leaks from any body orifice, there's no decline in the rigor, so there's no doubling. This would suggest to you then the body couldn't have been in this cloth more than 4 days. You as Christians will remember that when Jesus came about Lazarus being in the tomb, Martha says, oh, he will stink because it's been 4 days. Without the embalming, this was a major issue. So the fact that there's none of this occurring makes them think, nah, 3 days, probably 4 at the absolute max, and this body somehow has to come out of this piece of cloth because there's no evidence of the things you would expect to happen to it. So we can add that to our list of things we're kind of looking for in any kind of theory. And that, by the way, is my point I want to make sure I get tucked in here. This is a layman's list. It could also have another one scientists put together. If someone's going to propose an answer as to how this shroud happened and how we have it in the form today, they have to answer to every one of these things we're going to put on a list. We have many books that get written that say, oh, I know how you make a shroud like that. You take a statue and you rub this on it and you heat it up from the inside, and see, doesn't that kind of look a little bit like the shroud? And you'd paint a little blood on, and no, that doesn't remotely get the list of things they have to deal with. They can publish a book, and many sell books. You can find them on the bookshelves today. But what they're not doing is dealing with all the findings that you could understand either by science or just lay people like you and me reading. These have to all be dealt with if you're going to try to propose an alternative answer to what I'm presenting for you. Okay? All right. We finally got to our first characteristic of science. Characteristic number 1. The attempt to identify sources of bias. Now, anything that would cause us to hope for a specific answer could be bias. Anything where you want to miss something, anything to add to the interpretation. And you could get to the question, why did you do this study in the first place? Excellent question to raise about bias. So it's fair to say, I need to tell you my biases as I present, right? Okay, what's my background? I was raised in a minister's family. I'm an active, professing church member. I generally believe that the Gospels are pretty accurate. I believe that miracles can happen. You may not. Okay. But you're understanding my biases. I was trained in the philosophy of science, the methods of research, statistical evaluation, and my career, weird career maybe, was college teaching, then I went into government research, ended up as a budgeter of odd things, and finally, the last, 12 years have been a church volunteer. That's kind of my career. I'm not counting janitor and a few other things I've done over the years. Okay? I am a reader about the Shroud. I am not a researcher in any fashion. Why did I start? Well, I was a little bit like doubting Thomas. This Christian faith really made me struggle. I had an opportunity to study some things in college, and that helped me a lot to struggle my way through it. And it's also important for me to say, I'm an English-speaking person. You'll see why. So now we flip it to you. What's your reason for being here? What kind of a family were you in? What kind of bias does that add to you listening to me today? Are you a professing church member? What do you think about gospel accuracy? What do you think about miracles? What's your training to try to evaluate materials? When you've heard of this Shroud topic, what have you thought about? Why are you willing to come tonight? Do you speak English? Huh? Now you may say, why in the world do you keep coming to this English thing? Okay, put out your left hand. Put out your right finger pointing at it. I want you to put your finger in the middle of your hand. Is that down? What's the middle of your hand? Where do you put it? Did you end up here? This becomes important. We didn't know until about 1990 that that wasn't the right place. The Hebrew word for hand in the first century came to here. The middle of the hand was in the wrist. We didn't know that. We kept struggling. Why? You know why if you think about all the artwork you've ever seen. The nail was always put in the hand, right? Well, we're English-speaking people or European-speaking people. We didn't understand crucifixion. We didn't know what hand meant in that day. And so this is a point of bias that's been very much a point of struggle. Okay. The first thing, hopefully, these people do, getting together, is to say we can count and agree, right, on this observation. There's 125 somethings, all right? And we'll call it a mark. It's not a splotch. You know, whatever you're trying to get this figured out. The next question is, can we somehow agree to what we'll describe it as? Like dumbbell-shaped something, okay? Notice what we leave toward the end. Interpretation. What is it that we're seeing? Finish up all the counting. Finish up all the agreements up to that point. Interpretation's got to come last because that's the point where we like to. make a problem with our biases. We like to jump and say, oh yeah, he got scourged. That's because we're used to the word scourge, and that fits with what we were expecting. No, turn around the other way. The scientists are trying to start with the other end of it, reel in the marks, work your way eventually to what do you think actually happened. Okay, so here's the darkened images. And you can start to see on the back, here you can see it in a larger form, you can see a lot of little marks, and they counted them up. The Romans had a device, 2 different models are known, for whipping when they were going to have a person crucified. This is a poor attempt, but it's the best I've got. I tried to get the size right, even though I couldn't get the shape right perfectly. It's got to look more like dumbbells or balls on something. But if it's the one that has the leather, this kind of gives you some sense of what the size of the thing would be. And what you're saying is when the person was whipped, either 3 or 2, depending on which of the implements was being used, were put to the person with the lashes. So if you pass that one around. We think this is probably the best bet as to the model of how they had the victim tied. And so it tended to be whipped around the front, whipped on the back, and up and down the legs, but tended not to hit the head or the hands or the feet. So it's kind of like all the intermediate stuff is being whipped. On this particular one, when they did the scientific study in 1978, they found a piece of muscle. And this shouldn't be a surprise to us because the whole point of this device or the alternates was to tear at the flesh. So some of the models that were known weren't the ball bearing or whatever lead tip pieces. Some of them were sheep ankle bones. And the intent was it ripped in and it pulled pieces of metal. Now this particular one has not been studied. One person talks about finding cells and corpuscles also in the shroud. One of the things that's probably going to limit whatever happens to studying these pieces is the fact that the Vatican says unless we approve your research plan, we're going to disown it if you publish it. You can imagine a scientist saying, I found a piece of Jesus of Nazareth and I'd like to run a test on it. Not likely to happen, is it? No. Remember, the Roman Catholic Church isn't real keen about giving the blood in communion to everyone, is it? Give them the wafer, but not real happy about giving the blood to everyone. So a lot of things that potentially could be done will probably never be done, simply because of the nature of the belief system of the owner of the shroud. Okay, so we can say the whipping method matches the Roman method, the number, and the instruments that are known. Okay, now we're going to find that there are several methods of crucifying with the arms and several with the legs. It's not just a single potential method. When we look on the shroud, we can find that the fingers are out straight. The pagans and the Egyptians made them into fists when they buried. The Hebrews left them straight. You will notice we're also pointing to a particular spot on the wrist. And this is the spot where they think the nail went through. And we have called this, up until recently, the option space of desktop. I think this will be revised. I honestly think that the guy who says no, it's probably in the Z area, still in the wrist. Probably that one will eventually be a change in understanding. But either way, it has the same effect and has the same result as far as the victim. But the idea is, with the nail going through the wrist, you don't rip out anything. You can literally hang a body on two of these things and it'll stay in place. The nail then goes through and it touches a nerve. And it's quite excruciating, would be the correct way to understand it. Because what you're going to do is the person is going to move on that nail, as we'll see. And the word excruciating means out of the cross pain. So our word that we know in our language comes because of what happened in a crucifixion. That's where the word comes from. A second possibility for crucifying doesn't apply, but just making sure we're clear that there are other possibilities. In the late first century, they had the person sit on a peg, and so that the arms could be tied, and they left the person on the cross for a long time. That doesn't apply for Shroud Man, but it's just making sure we understand there are other possibilities. And when we see the feet, notice the right foot and the left foot. Left is so much shorter. Now try to imagine what we're going to have. You're trying to pull one foot up on top of the other and nail it. And this difference is going to give us great fun in understanding something, but once we understand you can make pictures of it, left and right can get reversed. So you have to kind of work at it for a while to figure out which is which. But that difference also may help you understand this. Surely sometime in your life you've seen an Orthodox cross and wondered, why did they have that thing on the bottom and why is it at an angle? Well, it's because Jesus is understood as a lame man. And so the bottom bar was tilted to deal with the fact that the foot length was not the same. So even in our symbolism, we've had some understanding of this. Okay? In the foot, there's no real problem about it tearing out because of the weight of the person is pushing down. So it's basically putting a nail where the bones come together. And you can see when you do this, you hit two nerves, and this becomes important as we understand the pain that then comes as a result of the crucifixion. The nail that we actually have one that we can look at, I'll send this around, this is a model of it. One nail has been found. And it happened when a particular person was crucified, and when they tried to pull the nail out, it was wedged into a knot. And it was wedged in so much they didn't pull it out, they buried the guy with it that way. So you have this as the model that comes from it. Nails that had been used in crucifixions were considered to be good luck items. So they were desirable after crucifixions. So as far as we know, that's the only nail that's going to be seen. Apparently around 5 inches would be a reasonable estimate of the length from the foot all the way into the wood. Crucifixion position number 2 has to do with the documentation. Here you have a person on something and they nail through the ankles. Again, second half of the first century. A person could literally survive for weeks in this position. This doesn't apply to Shroud Man, but it helps us understand that they had different alternatives. The purpose of a crucifixion was to set an example. You don't mess with the Roman government. They had the Roman peace. And that's one way to keep peace, is that no one wants to mess with them. So they had it in such a way that they would put people out, shall we say, on display. The exception was that the Hebrews didn't want anyone on the cross at night, or especially on the Sabbath. And so that deal had been worked out. Some of you may have heard of the place called Sepphoris. It's not in the Bible, but it's a town 4.5 miles from Nazareth. It was a major administrative post. And you can see even today the ruins of that town were rather impressive. Why is that important? Well, because in 6 AD, Judas the Galilean revolted. When he revolted, Rome stepped in. Rome put 2,000 men on the crosses on both sides of the road between Nazareth and Sepphoris, making them 21 feet apart, both sides of the road. Look at the age Jesus would have been in Nazareth to have seen this picture. He understood what the cross meant, because there were plenty of examples when he was a child. Okay. Third nailing possibility is from each being nailed in. And here you see facing the cross is a possibility. And because of 2 drawings and a magic medallion, this method is also in use someplace. But I believe it was primarily in the Rome area rather than the Hebrew area. So we're trying here to make sure that we're familiar with the idea. There were multiple methods, and there's only one that we're after for the shroud, but you may find a book that talks about something else, and yes, there were others. The one that applies to shroud man has to do with through the wrists and through the one foot on top of the other. And the body is going to go through a 55-degree, 65-degree motion, rubbing on those nails, the nerve against nail. The problem the victim has, you can't exhale in one position, but if you get it to the point you can get oxygen out of your lungs, you have extreme pain in your feet. And so you've got this body that raises up to exhale, and then because of the pain would go back the other way. And would literally go back and forth with the nail twisting in the 2 positions and in the feet. So this 55, 65 degree thing is what we're looking for. Also, it'll be a twisting as time goes by, and the arm would come out of. But here you get the idea of the blood flows, and coming one more, now you can see the double blood flow, and up here the double blood flow as well. That this body drips one way, oozes one way, bleeds one way, but then is also then going back the other way as it goes back and forth. So you're talking about, if the scripture is correct, shroud man, if it's Jesus of Nazareth, spent 3 hours going back and forth between the 2 positions before finally death. Okay? The nailing of the feet, again, you don't have to do it the same way, but the one that applies to shroud man is to put one foot on top of the other. I couldn't find the perfect illustration. What I'm really after here is when you force the foot down to the cross, it forces the body out in an arch. And when they did this to a person, as we're going to see, it puts him on a great deal of stress even without the nails or anything else. This would be the maximum of foot pain position. Why would they have done that to shroud man if he was Jesus of Nazareth? Well, I could think of a couple reasons. With the agreement with the Hebrews that he would be off the cross by 5:30, they might have wished to inflict more pain. I mean, that's one real simple one. As we're going to see on some of the other things, maybe they wanted to inflict more pain for other reasons. I mean, they certainly have reason to believe that they hit him and so forth and did other things too. So maybe this is simply one more intent to inflict the pain as opposed to supporting the foot and not for it. When they took Air Force cadet volunteers, air-conditioned room, and they tied them in this position without the going up and the down and all that, they had a pool of sweat on the floor under them. It only took 15 minutes to the sheer stress of the position of twisting and all the other things that were required and arching in the body. Okay, foot would indicate maximum pain. There is no evidence on the shroud of broken bones. They have bones suggestive of where they would break crucifixion victims' bones that have been found, but there's no particular reason to think that that happened there. So we could add the unusualness of the unbroken legs to our list. Okay, when the person had been on the cross, if you wanted to not stretch out the number of days or whatever, you would simply break the legs and he could no longer push up and exhale. So it wasn't long till he died. So when they came to Jesus, according to the scriptures that we have, they didn't bother to break his legs. He looked dead enough. They just simply checked him with the spear. But they came for the purpose of breaking the legs to make sure everyone was off the cross by 5:30, as required by the Hebrew agreement that they had with Rome. Okay, we're now ready to look. You have a repair patch, and we're looking at a side wound. And I'm going to show you where the hole is, and then take it away. And it's where the lance would have gone into the body. And for that, I'll send you around a replica of what is thought to be the correct size based upon what we have in museums. I would ask you to be careful with this one. This is made of lead. It will bend quickly. It's the right size, the wrong material. So just gently deal with it, but at any rate, it gives some sense of to what it would have been like. It appears that the victim was not very far off the ground, so that the spearing with the lance was pretty much a straight in thing, not a punch up sort of motion. So in our drawings or paintings, we often show Christ pretty high on a cross. Apparently that would be a misunderstanding. Rather fairly close to the ground, something easy for them to do, punching almost level. You're only talking about 3 inches from the skin to the heart, based upon the person being in this position. And here you can see kind of what it would be like by drawing. I'm going to stab it, if you'll watch, and then I'll take it away. And this would have been enough to have gone through anything in its way, be it liquid or be it something else in the form of blood or whatever in the deal. Okay, so Roman lance into the heart. Now we get to the head, and we're looking at the back of the head, and we see what gets interpreted eventually as thorns. You've got these spots around the head that are flowing with blood. You can see on the front some, and one of them has to do with, if you will, the eyebrow ridges, which they think come up because of the muscle spasm, and the blood has come around the various parts, as well as, of course, some other dots, shall we say. But we think that this particular one must have had like a thorn in the vein, so that it was constantly putting out blood, could never settle down like some of the others, and that this would have continued as long as Shroud Man was on the cross. The estimate is that the thorns were 1 to 3 inches in spikes. They've tried some circular reconstructions, maybe 7 thorns touching the bone, 7 touching the skin can be figured out. But they're guessing that the number is 30 because the crown isn't the way you and I know it. The crown in the eastern area was an over-the-head thing. We're used to the Greek wreath that goes around. And so our images tend to be that way. And the pollen would suggest that's the Syrian Christ thorn. And for that purpose, then, I give you the best example I can bring. This would be the correct material, but it's just the wreath instead of over the head. But you can get some sense of as to what it would have been like to have had that as the crown. Okay? So we have small injuries all around the head. It bled significantly and for a considerable length of time. We now come to what the artists basically looked for ideas up to 1898. So just over 100 years ago, this was kind of what they looked at. Between the eyes, there is kind of like a U form. And you can see this crease at number 2. It turned out that was the cloth, and where the cloth had a roll outcome of being rolled tightly. But nonetheless, that became well known. And then you have 2 items that often in paintings become hair on the face of Jesus when they do a painting. Of course, the reverse 3, we've talked about how that would have had a thorn in a vein and was going over the ridges. The nose has a curve to it, suggesting injury. There's quite a bulge here. We're going to see that more than one way. Injury to the cheek. And you can see the beard is off-center, suggesting it got pulled out. Now, these things are what artists were looking at when they were trying to do artwork, which we know today as the outcome. So we can add some more things about the nose, about the cheek, about the missing beard section being off-center, as we're trying to look for this material and understand it. 1898 was a major year for the Shroud because Secondo Pia, an Italian attorney, got a chance after an exhibition to take a picture of the Shroud. Photography had been invented, something new. And so they let him have an opportunity, and you have a person looking through the lens. Of course, there had been a huge plate back here in the actual camera. But he's looking at it. The man who did the picture originally, of course, his picture is being shown up there. Now, a typical positive looks like this when we look at photography, and a typical related negative looks like that. You can see how difficult it is for us to interpret a negative. If you've ever tried to sort out your negatives, you know the problem. I wonder what that was. You really like to somehow reverse it to be sure you're getting the right thing. It's not something that's easy to do. Notice especially the eye and how difficult it is to detect the eye and what it's like in the typical negative. Well, wasn't Secondo Pia took his picture of this thing, he found what you see on the right side. What he found was his negative was a positive. meaning the shroud is actually a negative. Ooh, intriguing. So now that what had always been called the owlish eyes on the shroud can easily be seen as, no, those are closed in death. But not until about 100 years ago was a picture taken to allow us to get this interpretation out of it. Well, once they did that, not only do we have an unusual photograph, but now we can start to look at the images as positives or negatives and so forth. Go back and forth. You have all kinds of options. So now you can get two sets of things depending on what we're trying to do with them. And of course, now the features not only look more lifelike, but they can be studied for the first time. So in terms of understanding shroud, shall we say science or shroud study, it only goes back about 120 years at most. All the rest of that time, it was pretty much an artifact rolled up and left in a casket for about 33 years between exhibitions. That's about all it was. And they misunderstood it because they didn't realize the positive was a negative, making it all more difficult. Shroud research first comes out, shall we say, after about 1950. And it's going to continue up to the time that science really gets into it. A guy by the name of Gallian was an anatomist and died in, before the year 200, right? And you can see what his sense of science, of anatomy involved. All right? That same understanding about the body continued until 1300s. And even if you come to the 1500s, this is a picture out of a medical textbook in the 1500s. And you find very few body parts, shall we say, are shown. And mostly it's daggers pointing out what happens. Now, I'm sure they had need for that, given how people got injured in fighting and everything else. And it's because of this that there's a guy by the name of, forgot his name, Barbet, who realized you couldn't have a shroud faked in 1357 because he didn't know what the shroud needed body-wise. And so this is where I started in 1978, and I would still recommend it as a good place to start reading if you personally would like to do some reading. You can't start at $4.25 anymore, but the book's still available, and it's a possibility to study the shroud. And it's the medical side of it that we got first. That intrigued scientists, and so then we started doing science in addition. Some of the things that the medical people found was the image had such exactness. All the blood flows were correct in terms of how it worked, both before death and after death. The clot serum, and issues like this, would not have been known back when the shroud was first known. The lance clearly hit both cavity and heart, just as you would expect. Definitely rigor mortis. The flows oozing correctly when you would expect them to ooze, the right directions. Dead before he's placed in the shroud. Death came from scourging and the crucifixion. Died mainly of asphyxiation, although there are some that like to argue that's not the prime cause. We'll see. Congestive heart failure was a likely contributor. And many think the chest was filling with fluid and compressing the heart. There have been 24 medical examiners of the shroud over the years. Most of these have happened since 1975. So knowledge has existed. As you can see, they come from many different nations. No great significance. The one you probably will enjoy is this guy. Robert Buckland was the one who inspired the Quincy program that some of you probably saw over the years, where they had all the cops come in and then fall over when they had the autopsies. He's written up a literal autopsy. It's about 3 pages long, if you'd like to read it. And he describes what he's seeing in front of him. He doesn't have the body on the level, like we're used to seeing in CSI and everything else, but he's trying to describe just as he would a standard autopsy. So we could add to it the shroud is medically correct, and the information didn't exist as general knowledge until after 1850. We now get to the scourge marks. We know that the whippers were of different heights based upon the way the angles worked when the whipping was done. The Hebrews believed that if you whipped a person 40 times, he would die. So the Pharisees said, we're never going to whip more than 39 times. We don't want to kill him. We just want to beat him pretty badly. Okay. Well, the Romans didn't have a limit. We as Christian people have generally assumed 39 was probably the number that was applied to Jesus. I'm going to suggest to you that may not be the answer, but this is strictly Joe Kerr and an opinion, which I've never published in any form. The number of marks occur in 2s and 3s. Remember the different kinds of implements. 25 times 3, 25 times 2, and you get the 125 you're looking for. If they each gave him 25 lashes, but had different implements, you get your 125 marks left on him. Pilate, of course, was surprised that Jesus died so quickly. And my thought is, maybe he was whipped extra. And we certainly know he had to have help getting his cross to Calvary. He couldn't make it based upon the condition that he was in. But as I say, this is just me having fun reading and so forth. But we know we had the whipping based upon the Romans, who of course had no limit on the number of strikes that they could give a person. This is just a clue as to the things they've had to do. No particular outcome necessary. They've tried to mock this all up, figuring out, is this person the right size? Now, the fact that it's cloth means you can pull and stretch. So things aren't quite as straightforward and simple as we would like. But overall, they keep saying, yeah, everything looks kind of normal. When you measure any part of the body, and we think the cloth is about right in being flat and so forth, it looks like, yes, it would be a normal person. 1976 was a wonderful year for shroud work. You had the medical stuff that had been established. They had a new toy at the Air Force Academy. A VP-8 image analyzer had been purchased by the physics department. And you know how people are when they get a new toy, they like to play with it. Well, they found that when they put a picture of the shroud into the image analyzer, it wasn't just a photograph, it was more like a radar image. Meaning the distance of things from the cloth to the body, it wasn't light and dark that was being shown, it was how far something was from something else. No other photograph has this property. But you can take a photograph of the shroud and do it yourself if you're so inclined. 3 guys were involved, John Jackson, Eric Jumper, and William Motrin, and they become the group that gets the next scientific thing started. Math is involved, yes. You have to calculate out the distance of where the cloth would have been and so forth to get all this thing to work. But this is kind of what the body would have looked like in a longer display. And because they had all these students at the Air Force Academy with nothing to do in their spare time. They said, well, why don't we make a statue of Shroud Man? So they did the calculations, and each kid, well, teenager, young man, however you want to call it, each one was to do a piece of cardboard and cut that thing based upon the information that came out of the analyzer. And they simply stacked these things up in order as you see it here. And if you go to the Air Force Academy, even today, you go below the steps of the chapel, you will see this Shroud Man standing there. They've pieced together by putting all these pieces of cardboard together. Pretty rough appearance in many places because the blood and everything else is on it. And of course that affects the mathematics that goes with it too. When they tried to take away all of the blood with the image analyzer, you get something more like this. And the one cheek is unusually high. And they think that's because it was damaged. Think about what your scripture says. Now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, prophesy, who is it that struck you? And they're estimating this is the size of the thing that was used. About 1 3/4 inches would have caused this particular damage. The eyes also look high, not totally surprised. We'll come back to that eventually, but not tonight. So we're going to add on that the shroud is encoded with three-dimensional data. It transfers to a photo, making it a very unique photograph. So this caused science to get serious. You had these two guys, Jackson and Jumper, who really started to get their peers interested. And so in 1978, you had this exhibition that was coming. And now we get to our second characteristic of science, called amorality. The idea of amorality is you don't take a position based upon a moral stance. You're not trying to break it. You're not trying to stay within it. You're trying to understand what is it. So they recruited Protestants, Roman Catholics, Jews, and agnostics, some who thought that the shroud was authentic, some who thought it was a fake. They wouldn't take a nickel from any of the organizations that potentially could have a bias. All right? So they didn't want any government money, no churches involved. Each guy was to come up with the cash to make this thing happen. See how they're offsetting biases? Not beholden to any viewpoints. How many of you have ever listened to advertisements that talk about a scientific study done about this wine sponsored by the wine industry? Yeah? Or the science that comes behind how good this painkiller is sponsored by, Bayer aspirin. It's the same thing. They're trying to get rid of all this and be legitimate about it, because the second characteristic of science is you don't want to have morals tied into it. So they eventually got 31 scientists. They started out with 30, but they got 41 originally. Finally. They were granted 120 hours after the exhibit quit. And they could do anything within bounds. They couldn't do anything destructive. They could take some fibers, very few. They could collect any pollen that was on the top if they could get it off. So they designed a protocol to last 120 hours. Someone was doing something to the shroud at all times. And some people were sleeping. All right, characteristic number 3 of science. You have to be open to the possibility of anything, but you demand evidence. That doesn't sound too strange until you realize there are people who say, there could never be a miracle. Here's an example of a person who's been a priest in a variety of things over the years. There's no miracle. Well, that person wouldn't make a very good scientist. You've got to be open to the possibility it could happen, but just prove it to me. Oh, okay. All right. Characteristic number 3, we establish definitions, and we may even make working definitions if we have to. So 2 of them example. Encoding is registering the information that occurs on the shroud. All right, we'll use that word. Shroud man we're going to use as a convenient name for whomever may have been in the shroud. We won't keep calling it Jesus of Nazareth. We'll simply call Shroud man, whoever Shroud man is. And then we can go forward as a group of scientists with our study. Okay? We describe this subject matter fully, but we try to avoid the interpretation. We've already talked about that. Or describe it, but don't interpret it. And so you had these guys trying to measure, do any test they could think of that they could pull off in the 120 hours as to what they had. Here's some of the areas that were in the group. These may mean a lot to you. They don't mean a whole lot to me. As a reader, I've never wanted to create myself as a chemist or someone in physics or someone in textiles or all the other things that are involved. But they had specialists on the team in Italy from all of these areas. And the whole idea was, if we hit a snag, huddle, who's the specialist in this area who can help us out? So you had this pile of PhDs in there trying to explain, okay, this is what I expect, this is not what I, and so forth, as they did their work. They first tried to make sure, is the method of creating it correct? Because the method of making, spinning, and so forth changed. They tried to put false colors on things to make things stand out, to figure out what they could get out of it. They did enhancements that you have to have special equipment. You couldn't do it as an individual like myself. To understand the next point, science does not have an accumulation of facts. Science is focused on trying to connect facts to existing facts. Meaning that if you came up with this one in yellow, you don't really know what to do with it. It doesn't fit our current knowledge of green, blue, red. Okay? So, characteristics of science number 4 is you try to connect seemingly unrelated facts, and especially across disciplines if you can do it. So, we're not doing random findings, we're building information slowly but surely. So the brown one down here is not a target, but this green one is what they were hoping, as they do science, to accomplish. Okay? And the great breakthroughs happen when we jump across disciplines and we tie things together. Such that we have here, ooh, when all those yellows fill in and you're starting to make connections of physics and chemistry and all that, oh, we understand a lot better what's going on. That's why you have all these people trying to pool their understanding and make things go together. Is it ever possible that this one down here becomes important? Yeah. I can think of one time that you can remember, not in your lifetime, when our science of the day thought that the sun went around the earth. That was kind of our understanding here. And they kept having these things happen out here that didn't make sense with it. They wouldn't fit. We had cycles and we had epicycles, and then we had epicycles on epicycles. And eventually the whole thing crumbled back here because it was so much easier to say, no, the earth goes around the sun. Bingo, all kinds of things suddenly made sense. So you can have a major discovery that takes you a new direction, and Earth around the sun is one of them. But generally, what science is trying to do is to connect existing knowledge and add to existing knowledge. Okay, so from the physics area, the chemistry area, in the biology area, you had all these specialists trying to be there to add information on. They back up their truck. They had great trouble getting their equipment through the airport, even in 1978. They had their chance. They had a special table built, and when the exhibition was over, they brought the shroud in and put it out on the table. Now, we'll have some fun at this point. How many of you have ever heard the concept of 6 degrees of separation? Meaning that if I go to Nancy and ask her to give me all of her acquaintances, I can get to anyone else in the world in 6 degrees of separation, right? And by the way, there's actually some scientific study of that question, and it seems to work. Can't be your friends, but your acquaintances, yes, that would work. You find that I could reach all the way to someone in Russia? Yeah. Well, in this particular case, the reason I raise it is because how far away are you from Jesus? You touch me, I touch the table, I touch the shroud, I touch the man. When I do this in high school, I had kids afterwards come up, we want to shake your hand. you get the drift of it? It's a new way to think about it. We're so used to thinking things are so far away. Not necessarily. Okay, at any rate. In 1978, they got their chance to have a partial view of the back. They didn't see the back fully because in 2002, there's a new exciting thing that comes. But at the time, they didn't get to see any image on the back of the shroud. They look at with the photography, they're trying to see, will the light come through it? Because a large number of the people are sure the light wouldn't come through it. When you see it this way, and you see where the image would have been down the center, there were 2 levels of cloth. The backing cloth, which they had to put on because of the fire, and of course the cloth in front. You did find some places that they had to have patches. And yes, there were some places where there was fluid onto the cloth. But ignoring the water, those kinds of things, what they found was the light does come through it. And once they hit that point, they knew they had a real problem. They could account for the water stain. They could account for the patches. They could account for the fluid flow that would have come from a body, but they couldn't account for the image that was down the center. So they knew they had their real puzzle because the artwork answer fell out. All right? So, characteristic number 5. If you're trying to establish some information, you have to ignore part of the world. You have to assume that some things aren't relevant. So, for example, if you're going to try to study the jet stream or snow, you could ignore something. Or down here, you could ignore the day of the week. Does it seem safe to ignore Friday in particular? The day of the week for understanding snow? As it turns out, no, that isn't true. Because of the way in which we put pollutants into the air and the temperatures we have with manufacturing, it actually does make a difference in snowfall. Oh, Carol learned this the hard way as a student because it tended to rain in a certain pattern and it tended to come in the weekends. And the reason it has something to do with the pollutions, the heat, and everything else. But the point I'm trying to get at is, for the shroud, they have an assumption that we can ignore miracles. All right? So that, all the rest of the way, that's a given in our approach. And also, you can ignore scattered iron oxide. Iron oxide is part of paint. Okay. And so the approach is you can deny both of these two. This becomes important because here's all the stuff that's known and suspected on the shroud, all the way to dog hairs. Some things there you wouldn't really expect to be there. Did this bite them eventually? Oh, it bit them very quickly. A guy by the name of McCrone said clearly this cloth was after 1300 because he found scattered iron oxide. He understood that as part of paint. He says the image has been put on in some paint. The fact that they saw the light through it, he ignored. Okay? He went with the fact scattered iron oxide. He could just as readily have said it's after 1920 because the nylon. There was scattered nylon. He could have said it was just as easily after 1800 because of scattered fly ash. Because of his opinion, two things happened. One was a lot of people said, oh, the painting, I'm done with it. Yale University said, wait a minute. He evaluated a thing we call the Vinland map, one of the earliest North American known maps. If he uses that approach and doesn't deny scattered oxide, we want to check his opinion of our painting. And after evaluation, it was decided, no, it is a genuine. The Vinland map is genuine. That his approach was, anytime he found a little flake of anything, then automatically he had the answer. And no, some things can be on materials, even though that may not have been the primary material, like the paint that was causing it. A few threads were cut, no destructive tests were done. All kinds of chemistry stuff you would understand that I do not understand, Bob, required thousands of hours of testing. They tried taking the dyes out, they looked for stains, they tried all kinds of solvents on it. They could not bleach out the yellow color that they were trying to find. They worked at the fibril levels. They found aloes, they found myrrh, they found things you would expect with a burial cloth in very minute elements. They ruled out an application by machine or hand because there's no directionality to how the image is there. By computerization, they're able to study the question of like paint. If you think about spray paint, there's a directionality. You can figure out where that came from. They can't find anything like that on the shroud. So we can say it's not made by human hand or machine. And now, my friends, we've reached the end of our first session.